difficult is this budget speech for the finance minister? We all know the demands of our society are great, and from what we understand, there just isn't enough money coming in.
I mean, absolutely, it's really, really difficult. And in fact, I mean, to think about it, had government in the last 30 years really been able to embed what we would call longitudinal macroeconomic planning, would not be scrambling like the way we are. I mean, for me, can you imagine that between the 19th of February and today, I mean, the country is hanged on this discussion about VAT increase, not VAT increase, VAT increase or not VAT increase, right? And I'm not saying that it's not an important issue, but fundamentally it speaks to the fact that we have actually not been able to grow the economy in a way that would expand our option, that whenever there's probably a standoff like we have now, that you actually have exit points onto the debate, but then you know that you have different options. So I think for me, that's the first thing. I think the second issue is that I think anyone else who speaks outside of the political conversation is really speculating on what's likely to be happening at 2 o'clock today. Or even, in fact, the signal will be coming from the from the cabinet meeting that is currently sitting now on whether there's an alignment or no alignment. I think the third issue is that the minister needs to actually learn that, and including the cabinet, by the way, that as long as they continue to give powers to National Treasury officials to actually drive the macroeconomic planning of this country, they're likely to be confronted with this thing. And I think what the DA has really done is to put a spanner in the wheel and really test not only its political strength within the GNU, but also just generally test whether actually the ANC, which has been governing this country majority, actually is fully in control of the macroeconomic planning. And I think it's a sad situation that, in fact, the ANC is actually as well caught in the space of scrambling for ideas, even though South Africans have entrusted them to govern this economy for the last 30 years, right? And so, in essence, for me, it's really a reflection moment. I saw the statement that the NWs of the ANC issued out that they're going to make it sure that there's a lot more public consultation. In fact, that process is very important because constitutionally that's a requirement. But at the same time, this country has not run out of ideas. I mean, I'm a heterodox economist. I belong in a network of groups of all other economists who have been saying we have options in this country that are at our disposal to make it sure that we deal with the growth crisis in this country. In fact, even ordinary South Africans have given ideas on what needs to be done.
Sure.
The biggest issue is the lack of political willingness, but also the fixation with a singular or one form of macroeconomic ideology, without thinking about a hybrid, even though we confess to be in a mixed economy.
Sure. I mean, Phelisa, the idea of having a more democratic process leading up to a budget is incredibly attractive. You know, you'd think to yourself, well, everyone should have a say, it affects all of us. But I don't know if you can really manage a budget process in that way, because it often does, and this is really the essence of economics in some ways, it's really about trade-offs. And if you have to make trade-offs through consultation, all you're going to do is have a room of people shouting that their need trumps everyone else's need and therefore should not be disregarded. Whereas you do actually have to make trade-offs. So, I mean, I accept, and I think it was a very important step that the process towards creating a budget becomes very democratic. I just wonder if it becomes impossible to do a budget at all if you make it too democratic.
No, you have to make it too democratic, by the way, because when you make it too democratic, there are several things you're going to achieve. I think, firstly, you're going to have South Africans who are going to say, myself, Stephen, Nomsa, Temba, John is going to say, in 2015, you committed the following. In 2016, you didn't come back and report how you spent on your commitments. And how are you going to spend on the 2017? And how have you been spending over time? So, and I think for me, that's why that democratic process is actually quite important. Because at the heart of it is that you're actually compelling government to actually really embed their longitudinal thinking. The second one is that through that, you build in what we call accountability mechanism, right? You know, along the same lines, for example, in fact, probably one of the spheres of government that really, really gets held accountable is the local government, because local government, through its integrated development plans, they have no choice. They need to come back and say, out of the rand that we allocated, we've spent 36 cents, and why we could not spend 64 cents, right? Or where have we used the 64 cents on? And in the national government, we've not been able to do that. In fact, for me, probably this is one of the ways unto which why it has to be democratic, because there needs to be a natural alignment between the State of the Nation address and the budget. And what we've been sitting with in South Africa is that every year the president makes announcement. In fact, I mean, this year, president announced one of the most ambitious speech. I'm not saying others have not. So it was really ambitious. So obviously everyone else was like, so where are the resources to fund this, right? But we should not even be asking that question of where are the resources. How have we met other speech, State of the Nation address, commitments and budgetary speeches? So for me, we do need that. The third component, Stephen, is the fact that budgeting process should not only start on the week unto which the minister is going to make an announcement. It must start actually on the day he makes an announcement. The following day, they need to continue the conversation and say, this is what we've announced, and this is how we're going to be able to fulfill the commitments. And this is where we're cutting, and this is where we actually increase in spending. So national budget must be a continuous conversation all the time. Because remember, you're also dealing with issues that poverty is a moving target. If there's nothing that has been dealt with, poverty is going to move on.
Okay. So Phelisa, I mean, my understanding is that it is a sort of continuous process, and they literally start doing one the day after they've just finished the other. There's a lot to all of this. Part of it is about the money that government is spending, is it being spent wisely? And if it is true that economics is about trade-offs, where would we cut back on spending? I mean, if we had to do a zero-based budget, start again, right? I mean, you would still find, after that process, that health and education would take the biggest chunks of our budget. We're a developing country, we have millions of people with huge needs. Those would still be there. I would argue we probably, and I hate to say this, but unfortunately have to start spending more money on defense, because the world is changing around us. And we saw what happened to our poor soldiers in the DRC, and how they had to come home through Rwanda, for example. But are there places where right now we could cut back on spending? I mean, do we need the National Youth Development Agency, or is it playing a valuable role? Where would we cut back?
Okay, let's start with zero budgeting. Firstly, you can't apply zero budgeting in a developing context, by the way, because this country was not started on the 12th of March, right? So that's the first thing. Zero budgeting is inappropriate only if you're starting now. But also the second issue is that the problem about zero budgeting is that, in fact, it embeds exactly the short-termism I was arguing on earlier, because then it compels public sector to spend the money on the 13th of March, and then by the 1st of March, they must spend. Because remember, by nature of development, anyway, you have continuous projects. And once you actually start zero budgeting, is that you have to finish the project. If you've not finished the project, you take the money and reallocate somewhere else. So that's the first thing. And already we know in the system the inefficiencies that are embedded over the years. The second issue is that, again, along the lines of being a developing country and emerging economy, you can't actually, there are going to be areas where you can't really cut, right? And I think that's where actually chickens are coming home to roost in this context, is that had government made it sure that in its own economic planning, it takes on different ideas instead of just actually listening or only implementing to neoliberal thinking, it would have been able to deal with issues of growth crisis. Just last week, Stats SA announces GDP growth of 0.6%. And I know that several people might have celebrated that. But you can't, out of 10 economic sectors, you only have 3 sectors of the economy that drives growth. Trade sector, and even the margins are very low. It's agriculture, but as well it's finance. And we know that normally finance does not really, it's just an enabler that makes sure that you move the money and use digital platform to move the money. But there's not been real investment in the economy. So in essence, what actually needs to be done is the fact that we need, and it means that other 7 sectors of the economy has really been growing in the negative. It's a strong signal that in fact you can't use a singular approach in growing the economy. So it means that there's a lot that is done. Now, coming to the institutions that you're referring to, I agree with you that we need to have what we call evaluative lenses. However, NYDA can't be the first institution to go because you're sitting with 67% of young people who today are economically and socially lead unproductive life. They're basking in the sun, or they're walking the street and having social conversation that adds no value in their lives, right? So in essence, it means that there are other institutions we might need to evaluate. I'm even worried about even the whole idea of increasing defense. In fact, one of the key things that South Africa has actually, even if we zoom straight into the specific issue of DRC, South Africa spent 52 days helping democratic dispensation of DRC. But instead, what we've then done is that we've actually promoted peacekeeping, but also military intervention. We are so rich in this country around promoting alternative ways of dispute mechanism.